Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues brings expert guests to the airwaves to talk through your divorce questions and fill in the gray areas about separating. From thinking about divorce to how to behave during divorce to what to do after, this is Divorce Dialogue. Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. I'm the founder of the Miller Law Group and a trainer at the Center for Understanding in Conflict, and I am on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. And my guest today is Jeff Landers. Jeff is a renowned expert with over 40 years of experience in real estate, mortgages, and navigating the financial intricacies of divorce. He's the author of several acclaimed books and a trusted voice in publications like Forbes and HuffPo. Jeff has dedicated his career to helping individuals manage the financial hurdles of ending a marriage while ensuring that they can start anew with security and confidence. And I know for a fact that Jeff Landers has been around in the divorce space for a long time and has a deep experience. So welcome, Jeff Landers, to the show.
Thank you, Catherine. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. And you?
Great, thanks.
Good. So, since we've been talking about your expertise in divorce, Jeff, with all of this experience, more than 40 years in divorce finance, what are the most common financial mistakes that you see people making when they get divorced?
Well, actually, the biggest one predates divorce, and that's where one spouse is not financially involved with the household finances, the expenses, what investments they have. And then many times, when, divorce comes on the scene and you ask, they don't know what their spouse is making. They don't know if there are any bonuses. They don't know what investments they have. And it just creates a very, very difficult situation. And I tell people all the time, I mean, even forgetting about divorce, God forbid your spouse gets hit by a truck and you don't know where your bank accounts are, you don't know who's holding your investments, what real estate you own. That's a huge problem. And of course, once divorce is on the scene, you can't retroactively go back and correct that, but that usually is one of the biggest mistakes. The other one is during divorce, and it's the title of my first two books, which is Think Financially, Not Emotionally. And obviously, divorce could be very traumatic and very emotional, but you've got to keep your focus because many, many times, and especially if things drag out, someone will just throw up their arms and say, look, whatever they want, let's do it. I want to get it over with. I've had enough. And then 2 years later, it's like, oh my God, what did I do? I made a terrible mistake. And I always tell people, for the most part, there are no do-overs in divorce. So if you make a huge mistake, you're going to have to live with it for a long time.
All right, Jeff Landers, let's separate out some of those things that you said. One, I think your first piece of advice is really marriage advice,
Mm-hmm.
right? Relationship advice that you
Exactly.
don't hand over control of the finances or anything else
Mm-hmm.
to somebody else. It doesn't mean that you have to be necessarily involved in the day-to-day decisions,
Right.
but you shouldn't be in a place of not knowing what the financial situation of the family is, at least more or less. Is that right?
I totally agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. And in the divorce itself, that it's important to make sure that you're sorting out the financial reality because, I had another guest on the show and that person talked about money as being really kind of neutral. It's inert, it's self, but we infuse it with a lot of emotion and emotional decisions. And that can be because we want the house, and we're going to certainly talk about the house. It can
Right.
be because we're not going to let them get away with that.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could come from a sense of wanting security, but giving up opportunity. So there are a lot of ways in which those kinds of things really need to be sorted out. What's the money and what's the feeling? I think that's your second piece of
Well,
advice. Is
well,
that
well, that's true. And the fact remains that, once you deal with the children, if you still have minor children, I mean, divorce is really all about the money afterwards. I mean, once you settle, visitation and parenting and custody and all of those things, the rest is all about the money and the assets and the debt and alimony and child support, if that's, the case with minor children.
Said like a true financial professional. Excuse me. I mean, I think there's obviously an emotional component, right? And
Yeah,
I think
well,
what you're talking about is that document that you're signing is not about the feelings, that
right.
you have to process a lot of those feelings. But when you're signing that document, other than the custody and parenting issues that are from a legal perspective, because there's certainly a lot of emotional elements around the parenting, right? That when it comes down to it, those black and white pages are about money. And you should be
Absolutely.
really clear what it is that you're signing.
And I understand the emotional part. I mean, believe me, I've had many clients and have called me, on a Saturday night at 10 a.m. crying on the phone. I've done that. I mean, even in my own divorce, which was very amicable, it's still an emotional thing. It's still traumatic. I mean, I was married for 34 years. That's a really long time. So
Yes.
obviously you have so much history. So I mean, you're not human if you don't have, some emotional, aspect of what you're going through. My point is, yeah, you have the emotions, but focus on the financials because that's what you're going to live with for a long time. And don't let the emotional aspect take over the logical aspect that, you need to face.
Let's talk a little bit about your books. In them, you've been delving into the financial complexities of divorce. And are there some key pieces of advice from your latest book that might help someone who's going through a divorce right now?
Well, my latest book is all about the marital home. So, yeah, I have a lot of advice about that. It's like 200 pages worth of advice. But the key thing is, and of course, in many divorces, that is the largest asset and often one of the most contentious ones because, there could be a lot of emotions involved around the house if you have minor children. Divorce can be disruptive enough to the children. The last thing you want to have to do is sell and move, maybe take the kids out of their school or away from their friends. So one of the things that I advocate very strongly, if you do want to keep the home, and not everybody does. I mean, I've had clients say, the home is nothing but bad memories for me. I can't wait to sell it and get rid of it and start anew. But in many cases, one of the spouses would like to keep the home. And I suggest bringing in a divorce mortgage expert as soon as possible because the first thing you really want to do is this even feasible? The last thing you want to do is spend a lot of time and money with, divorce attorneys going back and forth. Okay, how are you going to buy out the other spouse's share of the equity in the home? Are you going to have to refinance? How are you going to do that? Can you afford, the new interest rates? All of that. You don't want to wait until the end and negotiate everything and okay, yeah, well, I'm going to keep the house only to find out after all that time and money spent that it's, a non-doable event for you. It's just not feasible. So the earlier you find that out, the better off you'll be. And if it's not feasible, then fine, then sell the home and take it from there. And sometimes that just makes things a little bit easier.
I think that in my experience and in all of the financial experts or professionals that I've spoken to over the years, there is often a real cautionary, like a caution around the marital home, because speaking of the emotions, that can feel really important to hold on, to maintain that stability for the
Mhm.
children, for
Right.
yourself, for the other person in some ways. And that trying, people can like turn themselves into a pretzel to try to make that work. So, Jeff Landers, talk to me about your experience and tell the listeners, what to watch out for and how to make that decision from a say, really informed and intelligent place.
Well, I mean, if someone really does want to keep the home, there's usually two aspects of it. Okay. The first aspect is how much equity is in the home. Okay. And if it's being divided 50-50, how do you buy your spouse's share of that equity? So, what assets do you have or will you have post divorce that you're now able to go ahead and buy out your spouse? That's number one. And it really differs from case to case. I mean, if you're 60 years old, okay, do you want to trade, all the retirement funds in order to keep the home when you're 60 years old? Whereas if you're 40 years old and you have a career and you could rebuild your 401k, well, then maybe you do kind of make that horse trade saying, okay, in return for your share of the equity in the home, you could keep all of the 401k knowing that you could replicate that, refill it over a period of decades. So, I mean, all of these things are very, very case specific. The other side of that is, let's say, okay, there are sufficient assets to buy out your spouse's share. Now the question is, can you refinance? Because in many cases, if both of you are on the mortgage, the outspouse, the spouse that's leaving, wants their name off of the mortgage. So the question is, do you have qualified income in order to be able to do that refinancing? Mortgage lenders, what they consider qualified income and what you may consider qualified income, two different things. I'll give you a perfect scenario. One of the requirements for qualified income is if you're getting alimony and child support and you need that income in order to qualify, you have to have received that income for at least 6 months prior to applying for the mortgage, and it has to continue for 36 months thereafter. So in New York, the age of emancipation is 21. Okay, if you have a child that's 19 years old, okay, it's only 2 years until they're going to turn 21. You're not going to be able to fulfill that child support is going to consider for 36 months. So it doesn't matter how much you're getting, $5,000 a month or whatever, from a mortgage lender's point of view, that doesn't count at all because it's not going to continue for 36 months thereafter. These are the things that I help clients with to figure out how to do it. And there are other ways. I mean, if you need additional income, there's ways to actually convert assets into income. And that would be qualified as well. So there are a lot of sort of what I call out of the box strategies where, typically a lot of people don't know, certainly the people that are getting divorced. In many cases, even, divorce attorneys and regular mortgage brokers, because divorce attorneys aren't mortgage and real estate experts. And a lot of mortgage lenders and mortgage brokers don't understand all the nuances that's involved in a divorce case.
I'm Catherine Miller, and you're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce-related topics so everyone can divorce with dignity. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And I'm talking today with Jeff Landers. Jeff has written so many books about financial topics surrounding divorce, and today we're particularly talking about his newest book, Divorce House Sense, about the marital residence or the homestead or whatever you call it in your jurisdiction. But I want to take you back to something you said a couple of minutes ago, Jeff, about your own experience in divorce. You had a amicable divorce after 34 years of marriage. What are your personal insights that you might offer to our listeners about keeping the process as friendly and cooperative as possible?
Well, I guess it's important to know what's important to the spouse that you're divorcing and for them to know what's important to you so you could have a win-win situation. And that's what I try to do in my own divorce. That worked very well. And I worked on a case that I often think about where they had owned a vineyard in California. And the vineyard was very, very important to the husband. He had a very, very good job, but he was planning to take early retirement. And his dream was to operate this vineyard and have award-winning, wines and whatever. But it was a money-losing proposition. Okay, the wife couldn't care less about the vineyard, but she had other things that were important to her. So it became, and it was an amicable divorce. And it turned out like, okay, if I can get this to make me happy, this is something that's really important to me, you could keep the vineyard. And that's exactly what happened. So I think it's important to understand what really is important to the other spouse. Is there a way to make that happen and vice versa? And if you could keep it on that high level and not get into the small things. We've all heard about people spending $20,000 on legal fees over grandma's ashtray or vase or whatever. Forget the small stuff. I mean, one of the issues in my own marriage that my ex-wife wanted to keep all the furnishings. Okay. I couldn't care less about it. Fine, it's yours, all the artwork and whatever. Well, those were gifts I gave to her. I'm not an Indian giver, so yeah, fine. That was for birthdays or anniversaries or Valentine's Day, whatever. So, don't sweat over the small stuff. Focus on what's really important to each of you. And if that can be accommodated, then you have a win-win and hopefully an amicable situation.
Jeff, I think that, first of all, I think that's really good advice. And I also think it's sometimes hard because, grandma's ashtray or whatever, that's not the thing that it's really about, right? Like
Of
it's
course not.
really not about that small item or the furniture or the car or anything like that. It's really about some sense of lack of being seen, lack of appreciation, being respected, being valued, being appreciated, and really taken seriously in the divorce because somehow in the marriage that didn't really happen, right? And
Right.
so I think that it is really, you said a couple of really good things. And one is to really sort of think about what the value is. What's really going on here? What's happening here?
Right.
Right. And what are we really arguing about? And is it worth it to dig in on some of these things? And another thing that you said that I think is really good advice is to think about what the other person wants. If you don't care about the furniture and your wife really wants it, in your example, why not give it to her in
Exactly.
exchange for something else that you do value, vineyard or whatever, right? I'm
Right.
not saying a sofa versus a vineyard is the same thing, but
Right. Right.
also
Right.
because it just makes it so much easier on you, right?
Right.
And even if you gave up $10, okay, in the overall scheme of things, that $10 isn't that important. But if it buys you, that $10 buys you a better post-marriage relationship and a better sense about how you comported yourself, who you were going through
Right.
the divorce itself. Wow, that's priceless. Well worth the $10.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the, reasons that I really wanted to make this as smooth as possible is because, we have two daughters. I mean, they're both adults and they're both married, but I wanted to preserve the relationship. And, what would my daughters have think of me if I screwed my ex-wife? Like, nice job, Dad, I didn't want that situation. That was very, very important to me. So giving something up of a monetary nature was inconsequential compared to the ability now when we get together for Thanksgiving or holidays. And even though we've been divorced a number of years now, we can still all get together with no issues or animosity or anything else. So to me, that was extremely important. But you know as well as I do that there are many cases that are very contentious, and one spouse is doing everything to make the other spouse miserable in the process.
I'm going to make a comment about that, but then I want to ask you a little bit more about asset division. But no one has the power to make you miserable. You have the power to not be miserable no matter what they do. And
Right,
that's not always easy, right? But the circumstances, the other person do not have control over your emotional well-being. That's
right,
really up to you, a choice you give them. And one thing I say to my clients is don't give them that power,
right.
right?
Good
Don't give them
advice.
that. Yeah.
Very good advice. Absolutely.
So let's talk about asset division and how do you help people figure out what a more favorable settlement could be? Obviously, a win-win is a great place, but other than that, what are some other strategies that you employ with your clients to help them get a favorable settlement?
Well, again, it depends on what the goals of the parties are. So I often say that even if you're looking to divide the aggregate of all the assets 50-50, that doesn't mean that each individual asset has to be divided 50-50. I mean, you could have 100-0 or 0-100 or 70-30. And then when you add up what everybody gets in their column, it could still be 50-50. And if it's an amicable divorce, nobody even says that it has to be exactly 50-50. It could be 60-40, whatever the parties agree to, as long as it's, mutually acceptable. There's nothing illegal, and the final settlement is not totally lopsided in favor of one spouse over the other. So maybe for one spouse, maybe getting more alimony might be important because maybe they need the money to qualify for a refinancing of the mortgage or to buy a new home and get a mortgage. So maybe they say, look, instead of, the other spouse's 401k, instead of dividing it 50-50, is I'll only take 30% of that, but in return, I want, another $1,000 a month or whatever it is. Or I want it instead of, 6 years, I want it for 9 years. So there's a lot of horse trading involved where you could go back and forth, and you have to understand what's important to the other person. Do they want to keep the home? Are they going to need that income? Or is one spouse older than the other? So, maintaining their 401k is going to be very important, but there are other assets that could be divided maybe in a different ratio. So it's all of those things that, you've got to take into consideration. So, it really is case dependent as what are the ages of the parties, what's the income, what are they looking to accomplish post divorce. So all of those things become part of the calculus to figure out how do you divide assets. So essentially it becomes a win-win for both spouses.
You're listening to the Divorce Dialogues podcast, and I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues has been educating people about divorce and relationship issues for over 10 years. Please subscribe to the podcast and don't forget to check out our previous episodes on the podcast website, divorcedialogues.com. And I'm talking today with Jeff Landers about his new book, Divorce House Sense. And Jeff, if people want to learn more about your book or more about you, how can they do that?
Just go to the website, divorcehousesense.com, and that's sense, sense.com, and you could get the book there. And for your listeners today, when they check out, they could get $2 discount off of the book by just entering in capital letters where the text box is for the discount code DD.
Thank you. So, after divorce, and I think a lot of people are really nervous about the post-divorce financial landscape, maybe the post-divorce landscape for everything, but it can be daunting to really make that shift from married, divorcing, divorced. Now we're splitting up the assets, whatever cash flow, alimony, child support plan that's going into place. Now the rubber hits the road. And what are some first steps that you recommend people can do to rebuild their financial independence and feel a little bit more confident about that?
Well, when you say rebuild, I mean, the first thing is you need to make sure that your divorce settlement sets you up for financial success going forward to the extent possible. I mean, it depends on the amount of assets and all of that. I assume in my calculations that people are going to live to the age of 100. Okay, so I mean, if you're 50 years old getting divorced, are you going to have enough assets to last 50 years without ever working again? Very few people can do that. But what I do suggest, one of the first things you should do is get a financial advisor. Okay, if you have assets, how do you invest that? I used to do that. I used to have my own RIA where I gave investment advice. I gave that up, but I always invested my clients' money post-divorce very conservatively, not too conservatively because you have to stay on top of inflation. So, if inflation's 2%, a 3 or 3.5% return is great. If you're going to try to get a 7 or 8% return, the higher the rate of return, the higher the risk. And if you're just going to have this pot of assets, you may never be able to replicate that again. Okay, depending on where you are in life. I mean, if you're a doctor or an attorney and, you're making a couple of $100,000 a year, yeah, maybe you can. If you've been a stay-at-home mom and you have a few, $100,000 now in your 401k, you may never be able to replicate that again. So, making sure that what you have lasts as long as possible is important. And then you've got to look at your budget. I mean, where are you spending money? How much are you spending? And I always tell, especially female clients, don't forget, you're getting divorced. You may not be thinking about it now. It may be the last thing you're thinking of, but eventually you're probably going to start dating again. Okay, maybe you need to get a new wardrobe. You're going to get your hair done. You're going to have mani-pedis and, you're going to do all of that. build that into the budget so that there are no surprises and, unnecessary things. I mean, how many cable subscriptions do you have? Do you need all of them? I mean, there are ways to save money and just be smart. But yeah, get a good financial advisor, especially someone that's used to dealing with people post-divorce, because they have to understand, you're not putting all your money into the latest high-tech, situation. You want to be rather conservative and not take too much of a risk.
Thinking about the budget, I hate the word budget because it sounds like diet, right? It sounds like
Right, right.
restriction, but it's really about measuring. And I had a couple in mediation a number of years ago who I sent off to do their budgets, and
Hmm.
they came back in, and the husband said, "I cannot believe how much money I'm spending at Starbucks. I'm going to just bring my coffee to work in a carafe most of the time because that's a ridiculous amount of money." And they were doing fine living together, but living apart, of course, was going to cost a significant amount more. And he was looking for ways to make that happen. So I think there's a lot of ways in which we piddle away money that we're not really aware of.
Totally true. And it doesn't matter what income level you're at. So I had a client that was spending $20,000 a month on clothing. Okay. Why? She had, a bunch of different credit cards. She would charge, she wasn't even going to Saks. She was going to Bergdorf. I remember telling her, don't you think maybe instead of Bergdorf, you could go to Saks instead or whatever? I
Or
mean,
the Gap.
but right, she had no clue because it was, she put it on this credit card, that credit card, didn't really look. She had no clue she was spending almost $250,000 a year on clothing. And I basically told her that the money that she was spending, I mean, they had very significant assets, and her half would have been, I forget, in the $15 million range, something like that. But I said, your burn rate is unsustainable. I said, you're doing great now, but I said, in 20 years from now, you're going to be broke. You just can't keep spending that kind of money. It was a shock to her. She was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, no, I think getting real about how you're spending your money and how you want to spend it, what you want to do with it,
What's your
that's
priorities?
a really, really important shift for some people to make in the divorce process.
Absolutely.
So, Jeff, I'm really curious about your view of the future. What do you think the future trends of divorce are in this country?
Well, what really makes me concerned is that there are a number of states right now that are trying to, or they're thinking about rethinking no fault divorce. So going back to the old days when, there was cause, whether, it was abuse or adultery or things of that nature, I think that would be a very, very dangerous move. Now it's, only a handful of states and they're only thinking about it at this point, so nobody's passed any legislation. But if it does, there certainly might be a number of copycat states that start going, down the same road. And I think that would be extremely problematic. So I'm really hoping that it's a fleeting thought.
It's really interesting. New York was among the last, I think, the last state,
Hmm.
ironically, in some ways, to get rid of fault divorce.
Right.
And one of the reasons for that was women's groups. Women's groups were concerned that going to no fault divorce would be bad for women. I don't think that's true. I think actually it allows women to get out of marriages without having to say something bad about a potentially abusive spouse. But I'm wondering, Jeff
Exactly.
Landers, what your thoughts are about
I,
that.
I totally agree with you. I mean, do we really want to go back to the days where you have to hire a private investigator to sit outside, taking pictures of, somebody's window and, who's there and who's not in order to prove that there's adultery or, in abusive situations where someone's life could literally be in danger? No, I think that would be an extremely bad road to go down.
I agree. So, in our last minute or two here, what are some resources and tools besides your consulting services that you recommend people consider?
Well, what I often recommend to people when they're looking for a divorce attorney, and especially if it's in, a state or a geographic area that I don't know anybody or nobody in my network can recommend, I suggest that they go to the AAML.org, the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. It's a great place to go, supposedly all the attorneys are vetted and they have to, I think, have 80% of their practice devoted to family law. And I think they have to have been practicing for at least 10 years. It's a good place to start. That's often what I do, or I'll go there myself if I'm trying to help a client, find an attorney. I read their bios. In some cases, I've even done it for clients. I've interviewed 2 or 3 attorneys and, to get a feel of how I thought they were thinking and what their attitude was. And then I would go back to my client and say, okay, here are some that I spoke to. I like these 2 or whatever, but you interview them. It's obviously ultimate decision yours and you're paying for them. So see who you're most comfortable with. But I think it's a great starting point if you don't even know who to turn to for, a divorce attorney.
I'm going to ask you one other question because when you say that you've called some attorneys and interviewed them, I've called many financial advisors and interviewed them on behalf of my
Right.
clients. So if someone is thinking about, well, how you suggested a few minutes ago, Jeff Landers, that anyone's going through a divorce, get a financial advisor. How do
Right.
you recommend that somebody find the right person for them?
The first thing I usually recommend is don't use the same financial advisor as your ex-spouse. And in some cases, don't even use the same firm. There may be very good reasons, depending on your situation, that you don't want your ex-spouse to know what you're doing and how much money you have and whatever. And the truth of the matter is, especially among the same firm, financial advisors talk to each other. Whether they should or they shouldn't, and it's private information. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I think it's important to find a financial advisor that has experience working with divorcing people because it's very, very different than dealing with someone that's never been married or someone that's married and now they're doing things as a couple. So I think that's important. There's a tool online called Broker Check where you could find out if they've done anything wrong, how long they've been in the business, and how many firms they've worked for. If they've been at 6 firms in the last 2 years, that's a red flag. So you would try to get recommendations from that potential financial advisor. If permission is granted, maybe call some of their current clients and see, are they doing a good job? Do you just hear from them, once or twice a year? Do they understand your situation? All of those things. I think like anything else, and then you go on your gut because until you actually hire someone, you just don't really know. It's
That's
like
great
being on the
advice.
dating sites, right? People sound great on paper, and then you meet them and go, eh.
Exactly. Well, Jeff Landers, thank you so much for being my guest on Divorce Dialogues. It's been really informative.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.